actually a call for 50 individuals, and 10 of the 50 volunteered to be on the planning committee, which changes every year, as I said earlier, came together and decided that maybe what we should do is two things. One is focus 60% of the content on prescribed content. In other words, develop topics that could be addressed by the community presenters. Then the other 40% would be based on some things that we would do from content that is already happening. So, for example, we have content from our innovation grant recipients and let them present on the work that they've been doing. That's just one example. There would be other things that come to play as well, like case studies from outside the association industry. Mm-hmm. So when you look at that, that would have been the 60-40 mix that we were looking to do. So the planning committee with staff worked on writing up what the call for proposals would look like, and they came up with 40. And of course, as you indicated, they were put out. When they were put out, members of the community said, well, some of this stuff looks like it was copied. And so we did a deep dive on that, looked back and found, sure enough, that 6 of the 40 had language in it and phraseology in it from publications, actually outside of ASAE. Harvard Business Review, Stanford Business School, Ernst & Young, I believe. So what had happened in the process as they were writing up these descriptions, language that people were familiar with having gone through the design thinking process surfaced into the write-ups. So that is wrong. We pulled it and moved forward with the 34. We did a deep dive on those 34 and found no other instances of any type of copying or plagiarism. Not that I want to call it plagiarism, because I think it really was more of an omission than a commission. Mm-hmm. People should have provided attribution, and they didn't. And that was a big mistake. And so that's why we pulled them, and we will put in place new processes in the future so that people are fully informed of the need to provide attribution. People understand that it's an important part of what we do. We certainly don't want to take anybody's content or intellectual property. And so that's kind of where we are right now. Yeah. Now, moving forward, again, another issue surfaced, and that was that of the 34, some people felt like they were topics that were associated with certain consultant members. Mm-hmm. But it's our view that those topics are very broad, meaning that a topic like governance or a topic like innovation, these are very broad topics that individuals in the community are known to speak about, but they are in the public domain. It is not intellectual property. Now, they may have their own intellectual property around those topics, but we're not using that intellectual property.
Okay, so, I mean, that was definitely a challenging situation at the time. And one of the criticisms that came into play was that initially it didn't appear that it was okay, let's pause on everything, let's take a break and, figure out what's going on and kind of like, let's put a hold on everything until we've got a plan in place. And so there was a little bit of pushback in association chatland about that. And so I want to talk a little bit about that communication mechanism. I want to talk about, and I'm going to move this over. You guys, I know that this went a little bit, it took a little bit to get started, but we're going to try to get to as many of these questions as possible. Reggie, this is for you, okay? So why hasn't ASAE posted an apology or information to collaborate or let the full membership know about what's going on with that? And maybe talk to me a little bit about why it took a little bit for ASAE to respond.
Got it. So first of all, we wanted to make sure that we did have all the facts about this, and sometimes that takes a little bit of time. And we wanted to post the this group first because this is the group that surfaced the issue, and I wanted to make sure that we stayed true to that. This group brought this issue to us, and I wanted to bring it back to this group. I think I agree that it's open. It's important that we have an open conversation. But I also would want to make sure, and I know you guys would want me to make sure that we did have all of the facts before we started a broader conversation about this. So
Yeah.
I'm still in the process of doing some of that, quite honestly. I'm looking at about 6 or 7 different plagiarism pieces of software right now to really determine which ones gives us the most complete look at all of our content whenever we do this, so that this doesn't happen again. I've run across stuff that only looks at certain genres of content. I want to get all content.
Yeah.
Because one of the things we're doing is going outside of our ASAE content right now to bring some things in-house. So I want to make sure we have that done. I think when we have that done, that 2 things can happen.
Mm-hmm.
One is if there's a need to have a larger conversation about this, we can. And when that surfaces, we'll have it. But you brought up something a little earlier, that this might be a teachable moment for all of us.
Yeah.
And I think having that software involved, and we can teach people how to do this themselves for their organizations and when that happens. But I can assure you that when we're finished with this technical thing that I'm doing, that all of our content will start to be checked at various levels.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that that's something that a lot of people were really concerned about because, they want to know, how do we prevent something like this from happening again?
Absolutely.
And to be, it was some other questions that were, to me, the more difficult ones. The thing about seeing that there were the instances of the similar language being taken, from these publications where it could be matched up, it is, that's troubling, but I can see where that's something that can happen over and over again if you don't have something in place. So I think identifying the way to make it so it doesn't happen, right? Finding that stopgap. Now here's...
And let me just address the one thing you mentioned about transparency. We are being transparent. We're here talking with you.
Yeah, I know. I was kind of surprised. I was like, wow.
We're not hiding anything. We're accountable. We admit a mistake was made. It was unintentional, but we are being transparent.
Yeah, and I am actually really thankful that you're talking with me and talking to the community, because it's not just me, right? It's I don't know, this is really clunky, you guys, but it's all of us, right? So we're all trying to figure out how this is going on. So I know I'm seeing that a lot of you are still asking questions about the process and this, like the speaker questions that, how does the speaker process work and all of that. And oh, Rhonda, we haven't talked to you yet. So, okay, let's talk about the intellectual properties, paying speakers, this kind of thing. Would ASAE consider a more limited license to use consultant-generated content than is currently in place now? This is a question that came directly from the audience ahead of time. And it says that the speaker agreement used to essentially have ASAE have exclusive right to speaker writer content, and it's worth checking to see if that's still the same. So can you actually talk to us a little bit about that? Because I know that's been a topic of discussion and much back and forth about, what is the speaker contract? What are the rights that are involved, and does it make sense? So
absolutely, Kiki, and I want to thank you also for having us on. I appreciate it, and thanks to all of you in the community for engaging in this important discussion as well. To answer your question, would we consider? Absolutely. We absolutely are always happy to consider opportunities to do better, right? That's what we're all about. As it pertains to our consultant educators, even more so. We know how much consultant educators are contributing value in terms of educational content and all kinds of content and support for this community. So I just want to stress that first of all. But that said, I think it's important to be clear about what's true or not true about the current agreement in place. And so currently the Content Leader Agreement gives ASAE a non-exclusive, royalty-free license to both capture the session and use it afterwards. That is true. What it also requires is that we use that content with appropriate attribution. That is also true. What is not true is that we do not in any way transfer ownership of the content leader's intellectual property to ASAE or anyone else. The content leaders retain ownership of their intellectual property. We retain a license from the content leader to use only the recording. Okay. We also don't restrict the content leader from using that content on their own for their own business development or profit in any way they see fit. Speaking on the same content elsewhere, same slides, any of that is completely still within the content leader's control and decision making. And I just lastly kind of want to give a little piece of context in terms of how much does this happen? Yes, there is these clauses in the content leader agreement. It's actually pretty rare that ASAE elects to use its rights to capture the content. And so using annual meetings, since it just passed, a month ago, as an example of the 115 educational sessions there, only about 10 were captured. So we are not talking about current processes. And again, everything's always on the table to discuss for future improvement. But right now, we're talking about a very small percentage of content that's actually being captured in that way.
So I have a follow-up question because one of the things that people were really, concerned about was that, in addition, there had been something new that showed up in the speaker agreements, and it was developing this 15 questions and answers piece of it, which to some of the people who were part of this discussion, and I'm sure everybody's seen the thread on the Facebook group. To some people, it was like adding insult to injury because they said, okay, here we are, and we're giving you the right to use it, and you're asking us to help you sell our IP or our content later, which seemed a little bit over the top. And so, what are your thoughts on that? Like, what went into that, and how did it get added, and yeah.
Sure. So a couple of things. One, I want to make sure that everyone knows we do review the content leader agreement every year. So there are always opportunities to improve it. And we do that with advice of counsel. The 15 question clause, if you will, that was added about a year ago, actually, is actually related to helping in those very rare cases right now, those 10 out of 115 cases where we are going to try to share that content with others in the association community. It has to do with the CAE Commission's requirements for online education. Distance learning requires an online assessment for the person watching to get credit. And so that's where that comes from. It comes from an intention that we wouldn't create the assessment for the course that someone else presented alone. We would want to do it with that content leader. And the intent was putting it into the agreement so that wouldn't be a surprise ask in the cases where it comes up.
Got it. Okay. So I want to ask a little bit about, I know that it's a whole separate issue to talk about the paying of speakers and that process, but that is something that is definitely on people's minds as they're looking at creating content and continuing to, go through and develop this stuff, working with ASAE. And so, what about it? What about paying the speakers other than the keynote? And John, I'm going to put you on the spot. This is really interesting because I have to actually physically move. Those who are listening to this as audio, you're missing out on this crazy experience.
You're literally putting me on the spot.
I am literally putting you on the spot. I am choosing to move the camera over
to the literal spot.
It is. There it is. So, so I want to, ask you about that. Is there a possibility of ASAE ever paying speakers other than the keynote? And let's start there. Let's start with that, John.
Is there ever a possibility? Well, I mean, sure, there could be ever a possibility, but probably unlikely. You know, most associations don't pay speakers. And I think that what the opportunity is for the member, whether they be a consultant or just a regular old member of ASAE from the association community, association executive, is that it's an opportunity to share and present content. It's an opportunity to provide exposure. If you're association executive, it's an opportunity to provide exposure to people who may find you to be someone they want to find attractive and want to move forward in terms of their career, like what you have to say, like the way you do it. For consultant members, it's an opportunity to talk about what you're expert in, to advertise your business in a way by your presentation and the content you're delivering, not a literal advertisement, but rather an advertisement in the standpoint that here's what you're expert in, here's how you present. Is there a value add here for my association if I'm listening to you present? So we think that we operate in a very typical model.
Yeah, so I have a couple of comments here, and it is a little clunky, guys, but Willis says, nice to see and hear. Hello, John, Rhonda, and Kiki. Reggie got left out, and he doesn't care. And but it does bring up, one person asks, but most associations also do not charge speakers for a conference attendance. Attendance is comped. So, so what do you say? Spotlight's still on you. So what do you say about that?
Well, first of all, we charge, we reduce the registration fee by 50%. The view there is that whoever is the presenter is attending the conference and getting benefit from attending the conference. In some cases where individuals are only coming in to do the presentation, we waive the registration fee. So I think we are sympathetic to that viewpoint. But when somebody is coming and doing a program, but spending another 3 days at the meeting, participating in the conference, we think a 50% registration fee is reasonable.
So I have to bring up, and I'm going to swing this back over to Reggie because you've been quiet for too long, which is that the first time anybody's ever said that?
Yes, it is.
No, but you know, so one of the questions that was raised was, what is the role of the ethics committee in this sort of situation? People didn't know what the process necessarily was or what the role was for those members of the ethics committee. And we know we have one, but you know, I think that there was an expectation that either there would be more involvement there or confusion over the process if there's an issue that needs to be addressed. So you're on, Reggie. What is the role of the ethics committee in ASAE?
So I'll reserve the right actually to swing that back to John, because John, John deals with the issues with the ethics committee.
All right.
At some other point you want me to take John, I certainly will.
Okay, sorry about that.
No problem.
Reggie's like,
No
I'm
problem.
totally punching on
No problem.
So ASAE leadership over the years have had numerous conversations about the role of the ethics committee and the charter of the ethics committee. So I think we need to be clear about a couple of things. Number one, the ethics committee principles that are put forward for association professionals, as you know, as well as consultants, is aspirational. It is not meant to be something that the ethics committee can police, and that was done on purpose. We are not like a medical society where there's a in which the ethics committee or the ASAE board of directors sees the role of ethics within the association community. So we have aspirational, an aspirational policy that indicates, you know, about, you know, what types of behaviors, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's number one. And so the ethics committee is not in a position to police. Number two, I think clearly there really isn't a question of ethics here because we've acknowledged that it's wrong. I mean, it was a mistake that was made, and we've corrected the mistake and are moving forward to correct it. So while it is certainly unethical to copy other people's work, I think that we have acknowledged that, we have corrected that, and put in place steps to prevent it in the future.
Okay, so you know, it's interesting because I know that there's a piece of this, a very big piece of this, that is actually separate. And I'm going to put the camera on myself for a second. And I'm going to say that there's a piece of this that we're not going into further because it would, first of all, because it's going to be addressed very soon at a separate meeting, but then also because it's a much longer conversation that deserves its own focus. And that is this overlap of the situation here where it talks about a lot of the material that's produced by consultants that goes into the education at ASAE, and a sense of a divide between the consultant members and the rest of the membership, or ASAE. And I would not be honest if I didn't address that that's something that is a very big part of the conversation here. However, because we can only get through so much, and it's 1:14 p.m. at Eastern time, and I only have you guys for so long, what I want to do is actually give the people who are engaged and who have stuck with us on this a chance to ask their questions. And there are a lot of questions that are in the Ask a Question tab on Crowdcast. Yes, I see Reggie. Reggie is getting ready to say something.
No, I was just going to say, just so everybody knows, we will be addressed. We have a key consultants committee, and we meet with them all the time. And these issues of the relationship between ASAE and the consultant come up all the time. In fact, we talk about them every time we meet. So these issues, and specifically the ones that have been raised in the chat, and along with some other things, will be talked about at the key consultants committee meeting, which is next month. This isn't something that's going to be 6 months away or something. We're going to be handling these issues next month. And which, of course, what we can do is report back after we've had that meeting.
Yeah, and Mickey Rops, and I know Jeff DeCogna is really involved, but Mickey Rops is sort of the chair of that, right? Okay, so if you want more information, I'll definitely post more information as we get it. I'll post it on the chat, and I'll post it in the show notes for this. And of course, spread the word on social. But I bet that's going to be a really well-attended consultants meeting, actually. Right. Yeah.
I bet you're right.
So here's a question. What's the new plan for Great Ideas? Or is there a new plan for the conference content? And Rhonda, you want that, or John?
I'm gonna make one comment, and then I'm gonna pass it on to Rhonda.
Okay.
So that one comment is that we recognize we feel like we have communicated about some of the changes in some of our major meetings, but we also recognize that we can't communicate enough, and so we are going to be doing a better job of communicating the way in which content is going to be developed for all of our major meetings going forward. And so, and there is a document that Rhonda is preparing that will talk about our major meetings and will be released in a few weeks, so that people will be able to see how content for each of our meetings, which ones are the same, which ones are changing a little bit, so people will have advance notice about what those changes are and how it's going to be implemented.
I want Rhonda's let's have Ron, I want you to talk about this a little bit, because that is something that I know people want some insight in. They want to understand it beforehand and get an idea about, whether or not, well, how you're doing it. I mean, it's the Association of Associates. Everybody always looks to you guys as the example. For good or for ill, sometimes that's not comfortable, right? But I know that that's something that people are asking for more information about. So
thanks, Kiki. Absolutely. I think that a couple lessons learned have happened over the past few weeks, right? If not, we're all doing something wrong. Certainly, there could be changes in the future. And one of the big lessons here is about communication. I think it's how you started today's association chat, and I think it's a really good point to reinforce in terms of lessons here. And I think this document that John has mentioned that covers our approach for content development for all of our major conferences is going to be an important piece of that communication strategy. And we haven't had a piece that in one place shows side by side our approach like this, at least for some time. So I think it'll be helpful in that way. I want to emphasize that there's not tons of changing all over the place. Most things are still following the traditional process that, at least in recent years, folks are familiar with. We are experimenting with something new with great ideas, but annual meeting, MMCC, the technology conference are still queued up for this coming year to follow the same traditional process that we have followed. That said, I think many associations know that there are pros and cons to the traditional call for proposals model for our conference content. Mm-hmm. And in fact, over more than a year, the Professional Development Section Council has worked on exploring different strategies, emerging practices, if you will, for content development for conferences. And they shared some of that with the professional development community at ASAE in the form of a written report, but they really outlined the pros and cons of several different tactics. Mm-hmm. And so I think that that's what's going to happen with Great Ideas. We're going to continue to look at the pros and cons of this new tactic going forward, to your question, and iterate in true, innovation and design thinking mode. We will listen, we will learn, we will iterate, and we'll keep moving forward together. In terms of one other piece that I heard come up, should people submit? Like going forward, should we even try?
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the idea that there was any malicious intent, any commission, as John said, is inaccurate. And there were no content leaders in mind so that it was futile for others to submit.
It was weird because there was, don't mean to interrupt, but it was, there were some people who read it as, oh, it's already been decided.
I know.
So these people are in and I shouldn't even try. But then there were other people who were like, this is their content, and so I think that there were a couple of different ways that people were looking at it, and none of them felt comfortable. They were like,
yeah.
I definitely think that.
But let me just.
Okay.
Let me I'm back on the spot again. You're putting
there you
me back
go.
on the spot.
I know.
I just want to comment.
My shoddy camera work.
I just want to comment that anytime you change a process, ASAE for a long time has had an open call for presentations. And anytime you change a process, we're not going to be perfect the first time we execute it, mm-hmm. number one. And number two, people are going to not be necessarily comfortable with what they see, either because they perceive something else is happening or they believe something else is happening. And so I think, what we want to do is, as Rhonda had said, there was no intent to do anything, crazy here. The intent was to provide additional focus on the topic of innovation. And the only way that we figured out how to do that is to have a more prescribed agenda and more prescribed content. And so that was our motivation. And what I didn't point out, and I don't think anybody has here today, is that even with Great Ideas, the way we're doing it with the 60-40, as I described earlier, if somebody sees a topic or a concept that's missing that they think ought to be presented, there's still an opportunity to do that. So we're not closing that down. This is not meant to be an exclusive process. It's meant to be an inclusive process. We're just trying to provide focus around the concept of innovation based on the feedback our attendees have given us over the years.
I actually think that that's a really good point, because I don't know that I had that clear in my mind either, that it was, there are these prototypes, but that's not all, right? That it can be beyond that. You can still, and I don't think I'm alone in that, because I know people were saying, well, what about these other innovative ideas? They're cutting edge, but if they're not on this list, then I can't submit them. And what you're saying is that was never the intent, that it was just that, these were examples of the types of things.
And I think our error here, and I'll admit to that, is that, in hindsight, we should have communicated more fully. And that's a fair comment. And in the future, we will be doing that, which is why we're going to be posting the all of our major programs in about 3 weeks, so people have a full sense of what is possible for each one.
Well, and I think that that's a really good idea. And personally, I think that, you know, I know that Rhonda, I'm talking with you and Mariah soon about the Innovation Launchpad, very interested in that. And I think that being able to do something where you have a chance to get in front of these programs and give people some insight, a little of the background, and get them, because I mean, we all know, we're all, anybody who's watching on Facebook Live still, we all know, right, that our members and everybody, we don't read everything that comes out. And so the more communication we can have where we understand what's going on, I think the better, which is why I wanted to be able to have this discussion, because, you know, I think that in this community, you know, things are going to come up. You're never going to have these placid, still waters where everything runs smoothly all the time. And so what I'm most interested in is what happens next. What I'm most interested in is, you know, using this discussion as a way for us to communicate, for ASAE to communicate and share how things happened and how you're handling it and what's going to happen next. And then figuring out how can we then work with the community to make sure that all of those association executives, the consultant members, all of us who are working with each other on a regular basis are able to do it in a way where hopefully we don't run into the same issues and we learn from it, you know? Okay, yes.
So one of the things that I'm definitely going to do after I finish walking through all of these different pieces of software and see what's there, is I'm going to get a smaller group of the Technology Council to join me in a little project. And that project is going to be working with the PD Council, because there's two pieces of this. There's the technical issue. Is there a better way to find out, and a more sure way to find out when things have been copied, either intentionally or unintentionally? But then there's the process that has to happen to support that.
Right.
And so we could easily do a little small project and do a little white paper about this on the volunteer level, so that everybody's heard, but everybody can kind of see what we've learned from this process.
Yeah, and I mean, we've had these weird, because we're kind of shuffling around different bits and pieces here. I haven't been able to follow all of the comments, but I did catch one that was saying it's not a technology issue on the plagiarism. It's not a technology issue, it's a process issue. And absolutely, the technology is going to help, right? But it is the process issue, and figuring out that process is going to be so important, you know. What I think, you know, I wanted to ask you, and I had mentioned it before we talked about it, and you brought it up. You said that maybe this was a learning experiment or a learning opportunity, Reggie, and that is, and maybe this is Rhonda too. You know, so in the future, I'm thinking, a lot of association executives are watching and trying to figure out what are the boundaries. Some of the comments that came up in defense of what was going on was saying, well, when's an idea someone's property and when's it not? And this is a discussion I think that's very important to have in a time when ideas are capital, right? And a lot of, not just consultants, a lot of associations are, you know, we've got products, we've got all kinds of things that we're trying to make sure that we're developing. And so that's a question that I'd be very interested in seeing, you know, maybe if that's something that ASAE will investigate in the future and maybe share some guidance or leadership on.
So I'm happy to speak to that a little bit. I'm sure my colleagues will as well. Certainly, I think there's a lot of opportunity to explore this and other issues related to intellectual property, which we've been focused quite a bit on. All of you who have been content leaders know that over the past 2 years, we've also had to lean into an opportunity to look at intellectual property inside the classroom as well. So we're talking right now about session descriptions that might eventually in the future show up in marketing collateral. But really the conversation around intellectual property and the opportunities for the community there are much broader. They include not only things on the educational content side, both in literature and in practice, but also other sides, right? Content is showing up in many other ways, and our members are partnering with staff across the association community to develop that. And so I think, you know, your point around process, technology is that lift in a process, right? It's not the process, but it certainly can be an effective tool as part of a process. And I think that's what it's going to be, right? It's that there is a process change necessary. There is an education and awareness change necessary for people who are involved in the process. And there are tools that can also help protect organizations and individuals in terms of their intellectual property.
Yeah. And I think, you know, making sure that we have the volunteer community engaged as we do this. You know, one of the things I like to always do is kind of work out loud, so people can see what we're struggling with, see the kind of conversations we have along the struggle, and then see the output of it. And you know, we do this to varying degrees well, and sometimes not so well.
I totally get that.
But what I would tell you is that this is on our radar, as you can imagine, enough that we can work out loud through this process, and learn as we go.
Learn as we go. Boy, I am all over that one. So this has been a really valuable, I think, conversation. It has been for me, and I'm very thankful that you're here. I guess my final question to all of you today is, if people want to get in contact with you, if they want to follow up, certainly I'm going to share some of the questions that we got in here that we didn't get a chance to. I will, and I'm seeing some people are saying that the conversation that they actually had within the chat room was where they got the value. So, and that's fair, although I didn't get a chance to see much of the chat. So I feel like I'm going to have to go back and read, but I am going to be able to capture that, share that with you. If people want to get in contact with you, what is the best way for them to do that?
We have an address, executive office at asaecenter.org.
Executive office at asaecenter.org.
Correct.
Okay.
And I can assure people that that's not a basket. If something comes in there that John needs to make me aware of, I can assure you that he makes me aware of.
Okay, and
likewise, ditto that.
All right, and I see. Okay, I'm getting questions. Can you ask about these documents that we're supposed to see? So when can people expect to see follow-up communication on that?
Mid-October.
Mid-October. And can I make sure that today's participants see the chat comments? Yes. Yes. And all right. Okay. So I'm going to say that that's about it. I think we're at the end of our time. It's 1:31 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thanks, everyone, for participating in today's show. Sorry for the early technical delays. It's a tough conversation, but one that I think is much needed in the community today. And if you love the chat, if you want more of this, we're going to continue the discussion. We're going to continue talking. We're going to be able to ask these questions and communicate. But this is just part of it. This is just part of that discussion. And so more content is going to be coming to you through the chat, hopefully through these documents, mid-October. Look for those. And if you want to support Association Chat, check out associationchat.com. Become a Patreon patron for as little as $1 a month. You can tell me that you love me. And until next time, everyone, keep asking questions to learn every day. As Joseph Campbell once said, the cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek. All right. Have a great week, everybody. Great weekend.
Yep.
Thank you, Kiki.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. All right. And here we go.